to The Writer's Dream. This is a show where authors can talk about their books, how they wrote them, how they publish them, and how they market them. It's also a forum where we talk about how a story becomes a book or how a good idea becomes a book. Please visit us on Facebook and ask any questions you would like, and we will attempt to answer them. Our guest today is Dr. Loraine Alderman. She is a doctor of psychology, and she is the author of 2 books, Don't You Get It? And I Get It, I Get It. Welcome.
Thank you.
It's nice to have you here. And tell us about your books.
Well,
tell us about Don't You Get It?
Don't You Get It? Living with Auditory Learning Disabilities tells about what auditory processing disorders are, and also gives the accounts of people, their firsthand experiences that live with auditory processing disorder. In this particular book, Jay Lucker is the audiologist that talks about auditory processing disorders, and he also gives his firsthand account of living with a learning disability.
Can you tell us what an auditory processing disorder is?
To put it very simplistically, it's basically when the hearing is physically intact, but the way the brain interprets what the ear physically hears, it misinterprets or mishears. So instead of hearing the word chair, the person might hear the word hair.
So this is not like my mother's selective hearing.
No.
Okay. This is actually it gets mixed up in the brain?
Right. It's in order to have auditory processing disorder, your hearing has to be physically intact, meaning that there's no hearing loss. Mm-hmm. But the way the waves go into the brain, there's some misinterpretation, sort of like a bad cell phone connection sometimes. Mm-hmm. Or for the person that has auditory processing disorder, it's like putting together an oral puzzle, because you're missing certain words, you're not hearing everything, or hearing things the way that they're meant to be said.
Okay, so what did you attempt to do in the book?
Well, we wanted to let people know and understand what an auditory processing disorder is, and also that they're not by themselves, and give firsthand accounts of people who have lived with it and how it's affected their lives.
And you have a very interesting story about this.
Well, the idea for the book came about from my father. It was going to be his 70th birthday, and I asked him what he wanted for his birthday, and he said, let me think about it. And he came back to me and he says, let's write a story about what we've been experiencing. Because basically, I was diagnosed in my 40s with auditory processing disorder, followed by my father, who was diagnosed in his 60s. My son had been diagnosed after kindergarten with auditory processing disorder. And in advocating for him, I started to question whether or not I actually had it. And that's how I got tested, and then after I got tested, my father says, I've had all those symptoms also, so he got tested. And he wanted to share his story and his experiences and just how much it affected his life.
Well, I can understand that. I'm very curious about how you made it through. You have a doctorate, you're a doctor, and how did you get through college with this? I mean, I'm thinking in terms of listening to professors and classes and not hearing things correctly. How did you get through college?
Very painfully.
I would assume.
I had to work much harder than most of my peers, put in a lot of extra time. I learned not to raise my hand so much during class, to ask my questions after class so that I wouldn't be embarrassed if I had misheard something, which is quite happens with people that have auditory processing disorder. They usually stop raising their hand in class because they get tired of being embarrassed.
Yeah, well, that's pretty much like people who are losing their hearing tend to not ask questions because they don't want people to understand that they're losing their hearing. And did you feel isolated?
I kept feeling like, something must be wrong. In fact, at one point I went and had my hearing tested because I figured that something must be wrong with my hearing as to why I keep misinterpreting so many things. Mm-hmm. And then when the hearing test came back normal, I was like, okay, maybe I'm just not so bright. But I wanted to continue with school, and I kept working. I had a lot of support. My husband and all my friends helped proof my papers, because even though this is an auditory learning disability, it also translates into how you write sometimes, grammatically correct sentences. I tend to go back and forth between past and present tense. So I got through school by a lot of people proofing my work and doing a lot of extra time.
And so you were successful, and that proves that people can do it.
Yes.
And now your son was diagnosed in kindergarten. Mm-hmm. You were diagnosed when you were 40, and your father, obviously, much later. So the diagnosis process has become better. Why is that so? Why Why is that true?
Well, I think we're becoming more aware of different types of learning disabilities. When my father went to school, he was made to sit in the corner with the dunce cap on. When I went to school, they did tracking, and they didn't think anything unusual of being in the top class one year and then being in the bottom class the following year. It didn't raise any flags back then, because when I went to school, either you were mentally retarded and received services because of that, or you were physically disabled or a behavior problem. If you weren't one of those three, nobody really paid attention to the difficulties that were going on. They didn't know what was going on.
Now, where are you working now?
Right now, I work for the New York City Department of Education as a school psychologist full-time.
And are you involved in the testing for auditory processing disorder?
I do psychological evaluations of children that are referred for initial evaluations and follow-up evaluations. By license, only the audiologist is allowed to technically diagnose an auditory processing disorder.
I see. I see. And do you find, though, that children who have auditory processing disorder tend to have psychological problems as well?
Sometimes some children will have behavioral issues because they just don't feel too bright in school, or they get tired of being made fun of, so they'll become the class clown to get the attention another way.
I see. And you attempted to educate the public with this book. And are there guidelines for the parents
Well, if
or
children,
the people who read the book, not just parents?
if somebody frequently says her or asks you to repeat what you're saying, that's one indication. If they seem to get upset easily because of a misinterpretation, they have trouble with multi-step directions. There's a lot of things that overlap auditory processing disorders. Many children get diagnosed with attention deficit disorder incorrectly because so many of the symptoms overlap. So you really need a good diagnostician to make that differential diagnosis.
What's the status of the research into this? For instance, ADD and ADHD have drugs that are given to students, students and people and the population in general. Are there any drugs that are given to people with auditory processing disorder?
There is no medication and there is no cure. You basically learn how to adapt and how to accommodate, and you can work on the deficits and make them a little bit stronger. But when a child who is diagnosed with attention deficit disorder does not respond to any of the medications, my next step would be to rule out whether or not there's an auditory processing disorder and that it was misdiagnosed as attention deficit disorder.
Yes, and I spoke in letters, ADHD and ADD, what are they?
ADD is attention deficit disorder and ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity
What's
disorder.
the difference between the two?
Well, ADHD is when you have that hyperactivity where the person can't stay still, in addition to having trouble with attention.
I see. So have you seen any progress in the way that, I mean, besides the obvious, are there various modalities that are used to help people with auditory processing disorders that are better today, say, than maybe 10 years ago?
There's a few programs out there, some computer programs, but it works with specific deficits of auditory processing disorder. So it's very important to get a good report and a good evaluation done. So this way you know what the deficits are.
So it's like an IEP. You're evaluated, and then certain items are, certain areas are highlighted, and there's sort of a strategy to help you with them. Tell me about your son. How is your son doing?
He just graduated from Delphi University.
Wow.
With a Bachelor of Science degree. What helped him be successful through college is he was in the Learning Disabilities Program at Delphi, which is a great support system. They won the best in the United States. And he's the first one to attest to that program.
Yeah, well, that's a terrific story. Now, I get it. Obviously, looking at the covers of these books, you can see that one is a serious work for adults, and this one, I get it, is definitely a children's book. Tell me about this one.
Well, I belong to the Long Island Authors Group, and
Me too.
we have meetings every Wednesday, the first Wednesday of every month. And at one of the meetings, Yvonne Capitelli, who's my co-author on this book, was presenting her book, and it was about girls and self-esteem. And one of the things that ran through Don't You Get It is low self-esteem. I was given the job on Don't You Get It of collating the whole book and everybody's chapters. And without all the authors discussing ahead of time, there was a central theme of low self-esteem running through everybody's account of their experiences. And I started to think about, how we could connect the two subjects, because children out there really do have low self-esteem because they feel like they're alone. So Yvonne and I started to talk, and a year and a half later, we had a baby called I Get It, I Get It.
Well, I think elephants have that gestation period a year and a half. But that's, so what happens in the book? How John figures it out?
Well, the storyline basis, I had asked my son if he could describe, a typical week in school for him when he was in elementary school, and if he could pick out the 5 most difficulty experiences that he had. And we used that as the basis for the storyline. And it's about John, who is having difficulties both at home and at school due to misunderstanding things. And then his teacher suggests that he gets tested. And it shows how he goes and he gets tested. And then the audiologist in the book explains to him in children's language what an auditory processing disorder is. And then talks with his teacher as to how to make changes in school that would help him. And he goes from having so many difficulties and feeling he just doesn't get it to getting it and getting A's.
Okay, so when John is in school, what would be his, going through a normal school day, what would be the things that would be, for a teacher, for instance, what would be the things that you would notice him doing that might indicate to you that there is an auditory processing disorder going on?
Well, on one of the stories, he misinterprets what the teacher says. And another time, he does the wrong homework assignment. He didn't hear the teacher leave out certain pages, so he spent more than twice the amount of time doing his homework and then didn't do the last 2 pages because he didn't hear the teacher add those on. So instead of getting an A+ like he was hoping for his homework assignment, he gets an incomplete.
So if he were given directions, for instance, suppose he was doing a lab and the teacher was giving auditory directions, she was just saying what you have to do, would he have the same problem if he had written directions?
A multi-approach to giving him directions would be better, so both in writing and in auditory would be the best. Also getting his eye attention to make sure that he's focusing and having him rephrase back the directions.
I see, because what I'm trying to get my own understanding is it just his ears, or is all of his ability to interpret information from the environment affected? But if he could read it, then that's one way of fixing it, or helping him adapt.
Reading does help, but sometimes children with auditory processing disorder also have trouble with sequencing and organizing. So even though he's seeing it visually, he may have trouble with the sequencing and organizing of the multi-steps.
Right, and then he would have to learn to do things one at a time, step it, yeah.
Right.
That's an enormous hurdle for a child.
It is.
One can see how they could develop self-esteem issues. This book won an award. Tell me about it.
It won Book of the Year from Creative Child magazine. We're very proud of it.
Yes, and what was that experience like?
We got a call from the publisher saying, you just won. I was like, we won what?
Won what? A trip to Bermuda?
And he said, you won Book of the Year from Creative Child magazine. They really liked it. One of the things that we wanted to do with this book is not just make it a children's book. We also wanted to have it so that adults could benefit from it also.
Right, that's a special feature, right, at the end of the book?
So at the end of the story, there's a glossary of terms that parents will face dealing with auditory processing disorder, and also there's ways to help the child both at home and at school.
No, that's, I think, basically the two-prong approach is what got you the award. That's wonderful. All right, publisher. How did you publish this? Did you self-publish? Did you get a traditional publisher, or how did that work?
Well, with the first book, initially we self-published. We spent about a year and a half sending it out to different publishers, and we weren't making any progress. And I wanted to see it in print while my father could enjoy it.
Right, I understand that.
And so we went with self-publishing. And then with the second book, we had some nibbles from some other publishers. And then Stolten Company, when they saw it, they called me up the next day and said, let's do this. We really like it.
And that's the company, you were telling me that's the company that really doesn't publish books per se, but
They do mostly psychological testing.
Yeah, so that's an interesting way to go. You know, it's for people who are writing self-help books like that to investigate, you know, who is involved in that area rather than just going to traditional publishers. And then, so they picked this book up too, didn't they?
Yes, I mentioned when they were interested in my second book that I had published previously another book, and they said, send it to me. And I overnighted to them, and again, I get a phone call saying, I really like it. Let's talk contract.
So this book is available probably the usual places, Amazon, et cetera. What do you do to market?
We do different fairs with the authors groups that I belong to. We try to get it out on the internet. There's Facebook pages for each of the books.
What about professional conferences and things like that?
This past February, I presented at the National Association of School Psychology Convention. I did a continuing education workshop, so both books were presented there. And in another week, I'll be presenting at the American Psychological Association in Orlando, Florida.
Oh, that's big. Do you find that when you do the conferences, you sell books?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a good way to get the word out there. Right now, a lot of professionals are getting interested in this topic.
Right. And what about special ed PTA, SEPTA?
We've done workshops. When the first book came out, we did a lot of workshops for all the SEPTAs in the Long Island area. Parents are very interested in it.
So this book actually, or both of these books, are pretty well accepted and very well advertised in the areas that you would need to advertise them. It sounds like you've done the work that's necessary. What was it like to co-author?
It was an interesting experience. With my first book, all of us have a learning disability. So
Okay.
we hired somebody to help us with all the grammatical corrections, but even with that, combining all three with the learning disability, there was still a lot of grammatical errors we found after the first printing that was corrected when Stolten took over the publishing of the book.
I think I'm going to talk to you about these learning disabilities, because I am finding that I have, no matter how many times I go through that manuscript, you come back to it and there's always errors.
So it was interesting. In the first book event that we did, all three authors trying everyone to be on the same page and understand things. My husband was almost like a referee at one point, trying to go, okay, you're at this part of the page, they're at this part of the page, and till we finally were all reading the same line together, so to speak.
But I think that's so inspiring that all of you have learning disabilities and you managed to produce a book that obviously is very helpful professionally, to other professionals, to parents, and to the students, the kids who have these problems. And I just wonder, in thinking about the young people who have these problems, this affects their school life probably more than anything else, but does it present other problems in other areas? Like, for instance, do you find that kids who have this are less likely to go into sports?
Well, with the example of my son, he's very visual, and he's a visual learner, and he's very athletically oriented. So for him, sports was an outlet. As long as the coach would demonstrate what needed to be done, he was able to do it. If there was just oral instructions, that's when he would have difficulty.
Okay.
So like when he was in karate, the instructor realized after a while that he had to use him as a demonstrator for him to get it.
Oh, so it had to be kinesthetic.
Right.
So he's a visual and a kinesthetic learner. For those of people who are listening, kinesthetic learners are people who learn only by doing, or learn best by doing, I should say.
One of the things that I always stress to parents when they call me and they inquire about the books is, since low self-esteem is so common with auditory processing disorder, they need to find something that the child likes to do and is good at, and really encourage that.
Yeah, I can see that. How about music? Does music play into this?
I can't speak for everybody that has auditory processing disorder. I basically don't hear rhythm or tones. Neither does my son. So it really depends on the individual's makeup of where the deficits are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would imagine that there would be, I just thought of that. Music seems to be an outlet that so many children have, and I was, now that I asked the question, I realized that, of course, if you have auditory processing disorder, there must be some problem hearing music the way it should be heard.
You misinterpret the words to many songs.
Well, the words, yes, but I would even think that, yeah, the rhythm and the tone. That's very interesting. So many of the outlets that children ordinarily have would be affected by this. So it's
They're pragmatic skills.
significant, absolutely significant. What about the connection to autism? When I was speaking to you, I was thinking in terms of all of the attention that's given to autism, and I wonder if the fact that this problem has been isolated is because of all the attention that autism has gotten. Autism has gotten really, and rightfully so, a lion's share of attention as far as problems that children have. What do you think about that?
We've done some workshops. There are some parents of autistic children who like to believe that the auditory processing disorder is the primary issue, but research has really shown it to be secondary to the autism.
I see. So, but are they connected, or are they just separate issues that the same child has?
Separate issues that the child has.
Right. Now, is there an advocacy group for auditory processing disorder?
There's different organizations, there's different chat rooms and blogs, but it's still a new and upcoming diagnosis, really. It just really started coming about in the 80s.
Yeah, that's fairly recent when you talk about these kinds of problems. So are you going to advocate for these people? You're going to start an organization?
I don't know if I'll start an organization, but I do testing along with the audiologist and a speech pathologist to help children get identified, and I help with consulting, for parents that are trying to get their children different accommodations.
Right. Do you find much in the way of parental denial and obstructionism to the fact that their child might have a disability like this and that they need help in that area?
It's sort of 50-50. You get some parents who call up and they go, I'm learning about this. I think my husband also has these symptoms, but he was never diagnosed. He had difficulty in school, and now I'm thinking of getting my child tested. And then you have other parents who would sooner let their child take medication, thing that's attention deficit disorder, than accept that it's something that can't be fixed very quickly.
So it's the same old, more or less, that some parents wish to believe that their children are perfect and others are desperate for help.
Right.
I guess it depends on how desperate for help you are. Some of the people I've interviewed on this show have talked about books that they've written because of their children having a particular disorder, and basically they reached the point where they were tearing their hair out because nothing was working, and so they began to do their own research and found some help and in some ways cures. So you can't always depend on the usual channels sometimes if what your child has is so different from what other children have or what is not diagnosed. I personally, and this is just my own, and I'm a very unlettered opinion, I personally think that we all have a brain glitch somewhere. For instance, if I'm reading a map, I have to turn the map around in the direction in which I'm going, so it's some sort of directionality problem. And I'm sure there's bunches of other things that I just ignore. But so do you think in general that the population is being helped more now than they were in the past?
Definitely. And I also believe that we should teach the children what it is that they have and why they're getting accommodations. They need to know how to advocate for themselves.
Yeah, well, that's basically, with all problems, acceptance is the first step. If you accept the problem, you can fix it. If you never accept the problem, you can't fix it.
Quite often, parents just get accommodations for their children. They don't even understand themselves what the learning disability is, so how is the child going to understand?
Now, if I had a child who was diagnosed with auditory processing disorder and I'm at the first conference at school where this is being presented to me, what are you going to tell me to help my child? What steps are you going to ask me to do to help my child?
To have the child look at you when you're giving them instructions, to have them repeat back in their own words. It doesn't have to be verbatim, but in their own words, their understanding of what it is you're asking them to do. To initially, until you can build up the skill, give one-step directions and then build two-step directions.
I see. So it's pretty much getting them to key into their own deficit, more or less, and to fix, to help fix what's wrong. Yeah, I think it's very important to tell kids what their problems are and to help them. I think it's got to be, you know, a two-way street whenever you help somebody with these learning disabilities. I know when I was teaching, special ed was not always there, and when special ed came into the schools, it really was an incredible tool to help kids. I had kids, you knew they were working hard. You had no idea why they were struggling, because we just never even thought in those terms. We either thought they were intelligent or not intelligent. And when special ed came along and it was explained to us, you know, if you see these particular symptoms, you know, ask us to help you. And I know I had a number of kids who just blossomed by going for the special help that was given to them for their various learning disabilities. And I'm sure there are a lot of people who are helped by this. So what's in the future for you?
Right now, not working on a third book. Right now, we're just spending time promoting this book and enjoying the release that was just released in January.
Yeah, I would imagine just receiving the award and doing the workshops. Do you do a lot of workshops in school?
Sometimes at night for the SEPTAs and for the PTAs.
Yeah, that's great. Well, your work is very well received, and we're very happy to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
And I hope that some of the people who are out there have, in fact, learned something, and I hope that the show reaches somebody who has auditory processing disorder. Dr. Loraine Alderman, thank you very much.
Thank you.